Okay, welcome to the next in the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre's seminar series, online seminar series. And today we're lucky enough to be joined by Sam Friedman from LSE and Rose Butler from Deakin. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we're in Newcastle, meeting on the lands of the Wabakal and Worimi peoples on the campus on the campuses there, and pay respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders or First Nations peoples that are joining us online today. So, yeah, this we're having Sam and Rose present together on their relatively new work. I don't think you guys have been presenting this or have written about it yet, I don't think. So it's great on class diplomacy, cross-class friendship, social capital, and the promise of symbolic exchange. So, thanks.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, lovely to be with you and sharing this very new work. And on that front, I think really interested in particular on your feedback on these sort of preliminary results on cross-class friendship. So our primary departure point here comes actually from a recent, very high-profile piece of research on cross-class friendship coming out of economics. Here, Raj Chetty and colleagues analyzed billions of friendship ties on Facebook alongside administrative income data to show that in the US, cross-class friendship is much more prevalent than we might think, and then more provocatively, that it acts as a driver of upward mobility. Specifically, they found that those from low-income backgrounds who have cross-class friendships go on to obtain higher incomes themselves. And an identical study recently found the same in the UK. So the argument sort of emerging from this work is that we should be interested in cross-class friendships because it provides those from disadvantaged backgrounds with social capital that then propels them forward. Thesis that you might imagine is already being seized upon by policymakers keen to boost social mobility. But really, what we want to do in this paper is, I suppose, question the celebratory tone of those studies. I think the argument is perhaps seductive if you're a policymaker, but the quantitative approach used in this work means that really there's only a very speculative understanding of how these friendships actually work in practice. And also these findings, we think, sit in tension with a more long-standing literature in sociology that indicates that friendships actually rest on principles of reciprocity and equality rather than one-way transfers. So the aim of this paper then is really to interrogate that tension via a qualitative understanding of cross-class friendship. And we're asking in particular, how are these relationships actually formed and maintained? How do friends manage structural inequalities of class? And if friendships are based on a sense of reciprocity and equality, is that not disrupted then by these kind of one-way transfers of social capital? To frame our research questions, we're really turning to two bodies of work. The first is sociological literature that emphasizes this principle of homophily, right? That we make friends with people who are socially similar to ourselves, actually, particularly when it comes to social class. And much of this work draws on Bourdieusian concepts, particularly habitus, and the idea there that our practices are kind of pre-consciously orchestrated with and validated by those from homologous social backgrounds, as this sort of classic quote that you can see on the slide here illustrates. And in this conception of habitus, some ways class homophily in friendship is almost inevitable, or at least probabilistic, as the idea here is that we'll kind of self-eliminate from friends who might threaten the dispositional architecture of our habitus. And there's also a kind of assumption here, I think, that when cross-class friendships do form, that they'll be unsuccessful for those same reasons. But I think one weakness in that theory is that people do make friends across class. That is really what this new research from economics is illustrating, at least in its weak tide form on Facebook. And building on this, I suppose our contention as a starting point is that perhaps a Bourdieusian framing has left us a little less equipped to theorize friendships that are formed and sustained across class origin difference. And so instead, what we're turning to here is a kind of anthropological and sociological scholarship on migration and intercultural relations that actually theorizes how people build mutuality across difference. And we're particularly drawing here on literature on everyday multiculturalism that explores how people manage the kind of messy and contradictory practices of living amid and forming bonds across cultural difference. Transversal enablers, a term developed by the Australian scholar Amanda Wise, is particularly generative for us here, and describing people who essentially go out of their way to create connections between culturally different residents in their local area. And the term transversal, we think, is kind of actually evocative of kind of rupturing the status of homophily. In geometry, it refers to the transversal line that cuts two others that run side by side, where they're heading in similar or different directions or running parallel. And the emphasis, I think, in this literature is not only on exchange, but interchange in the sense of kind of opening up and reconfiguring identities. Identities aren't necessarily left behind in this process, right? It's not about assimilation or exoticization, but there's a sense that they can be shifted, even reconfigured via a kind of non-hierarchical reciprocity. This idea draws on the work of Sennett, who argues that mutuality takes place in friendship when we take part in exchange that is not objectively commensurate and is instead a form of asymmetric exchange, that we become connected by actually performing this exchange rather than being estranged by the inequality. Rose will return to that argument later in the paper. But just to tell you a little bit about the project methodologically. So this is 41 in-depth interviews with individuals. So far in the UK, we plan to do in Australia too, very soon. Those people responded to adverts that we placed on local, like online community boards or employer message boards in a range of different fields. And essentially, they just asked people for volunteers who, and this is the wording, had had a close friendship in their life with someone from a different class or socioeconomic background to themselves, even if that friendship has now faded or ended. And this yielded about over 100 volunteers who we asked to email us with their background and other demographic characteristics. And then we constructed a sample with an equal number of interviewees from more advantaged and disadvantaged backgrounds, and which was sort of broadly representative in terms of gender, sexuality, age. So it's worth saying, these are generally, this has got a whole range of people in different ages, and largely these are people who have been in friendships for quite some time. To a lesser extent, it's representative on location. I should say London was overrepresented. I think it's also worth just quickly saying that there are lots of limitations to this design. One of them, I think, in particular, is that, we are interviewing people who self-selected into a study about cross-class friendship. So we are probably underrepresenting the experience of those who maybe are in those friendships, but don't actually categorize them in that way. Hard to overcome that, I think, methodologically, but worth noting. Okay, so it's worth noting, I think, that we were quite struck by how prevalent actually this cultivation of social capital was in the friendships we studied. Without prompting, most of the interviewees that we spoke to, regardless of their own class background, discussed the ways in which friendship had provided sources of advantage for the friend coming from the less advantaged background. And this tended to play out in three ways. First, the more privileged friend or their family had provided kind of concrete support in education or the labor market. In others, the support was more blunt in the form of kind of financial gifts or loans in the friendship. And in other cases, there was sort of what Annette would call a kind of cultural guiding process taking place, with upwardly mobile friends being kind of helped in the navigation of sort of dominant behavioral codes in upper middle class spaces. But, and I think it's worth saying kind of straight off the bat, interviews also underlined actually the profound limitations of reducing friendships to these kinds of one-way transfers of resources, right? Which is central to the Chetty study. And what was interesting to us was that among participants who tended to foreground or sort of note the importance of those transfers to the friendship, that had often been accompanied by significant tensions in the friendship itself. So Nadia and Shanti were both in their early 30s. They'd been best friends since secondary school. Nadia grew up in a complex mixed class family in West London. Her close friend Shanti described her family as very well off. Both Nadia and Shanti agreed, we actually interviewed them both, that on the whole, their backgrounds hadn't impeded their relationship, in large part because these differences had been supplanted by what Nadia described as the bonding effect of being two women of color growing up in a very white area. But the issue of money had been an ongoing source of tension in the friendship. Nadia, whose upbringing had been marked by significant economic precarity, explained her discomfort at Shanti continually offering to buy things or fund things for her. It took me a long time to build up, she told us. But eventually I was like, Shanti, I just feel really embarrassed about my monetary situation. Stop. Interviewees who talked about their privileged friends acting as cultural guides also reported, I think, quite complex feelings often. Many were torn between recognizing the value of this kind of guidance, especially for their careers, and resentment actually at the same time, that the implication that accepting that guidance somehow implied some sort of deficit in the values of their own class background. Tanya, a government researcher in her 30s from a white working class background, had met Florence at Durham University, a kind of a university synonymous with privately educated students. While Tanya had performed well at Durham, she recalled sort of struggling with the social side of things, especially what she described as the more opulent settings she found herself socializing in. And in these sort of alien environments, Florence, who was white and privately educated, had acted as what Tanya calls here in this quote, her pathfinder. But Tanya had really mixed feelings about this. She acknowledged that it had helped her sort of navigate behavioral codes in her subsequent career in the civil service, but she was troubled by this sort of pathfinder status in the sense that it felt that the friendship was contingent on her kind of class acculturation. The sense, as she expresses in this quote here, that if she somehow drops back down, Florence is unlikely to stick around in the friendship. In some cases, these difficulties had acted actually as downward spirals in the friendship. They'd sort of been the source of those spirals. Sue, who was from a poor, unemployed single parent family, met her wealthy friend Lara on a graduate scheme at work. She described that early in the friendship, there was a kind of attraction or intrigue, and she found herself imitating Lara, particularly in workplace settings. But this had been difficult, she explained, because it was never a kind of two-way street. She recalled, for example, countless invites to Lara's family home to ride her horses, but then this sort of lingering embarrassment about the fact that she didn't feel she could reciprocate. And more generally, she described the process of kind of cultural mimicry as really quite exhausting. I felt like I had to put up this front that wasn't me, she says here, and explained that, there was this constant uneasiness, and that actually eventually caused her to step away from the friendship. So in some ways, I think our interviews do lend some support to the argument that cross-class friendships produce social capital. However, I think they also demonstrate that friendships that were defined or dominated by this kind of one way of transfer of resources were often actually the most vulnerable to rupture. And it's worth saying, though, that the vast majority of friendships that we studied, around 3/4, were successful and had remained strong over long periods of time. It's not that class difference was any less present in these friendships, nor that class tensions were absent. The difference was that scaffolding these friendships were histories of exchange, which had protected friends from becoming estranged by that inequality. And our core argument that I want to move to now is that this scaffolding was contingent on a process that we're terming here class diplomacy. Now, that idea actually emerged from one of our interviewees. This is Lisa. Lisa was white. She was from a working class background. She described occupying a kind of diplomatic type role, was her words, in order to mediate the moments when class inequalities had manifested in tangible ways with her wealthy and long-standing friend Haley. Now, it's important, I think, to clarify what we mean and what we don't mean by diplomacy. Diplomacy tends to be understood in two ways. One, as a kind of management of relationships between two countries, right? Two, as a more general skill in handling affairs without arousing hostility. That's the kind of dictionary definition. So we're really working with the second of those definitions here. Certainly, we would distance ourselves, I think, from the idea that our participants were acting in any way in the sense of the first definition as diplomats. Not only, I think, does the popular image of the diplomat hold deeply classed connotations of a typically white, middle class professional, But the work of a diplomat is routinely characterized as kind of detached and strategic. And I think what you'll see here is that these are very different, very impassioned, actually, accounts of friendship. So our use of diplomacy, I think, instead reflects what we would see as a kind of intricate interactional skill implied by that second definition. How managing class difference was a kind of routine and ongoing part of these friendships, and that upholding friendships flagged by class difference required a kind of significant investment of emotional labor, although the burden of this was not necessarily equally felt, often carried more by the less advantaged friend. And I think we would say we sort of identified in the data three sort of modes of class diplomacy that I want to take you through now: joking, avoiding, and confronting. These weren't mutually exclusive, and interviews often utilized more than one. The first, joking, was about really the use of humor in friendship. Here, many mentioned that they'd used self-deprecation, mockery to voice class difference, but in so doing, kind of diffuse the tension it created. It's worth saying that humor was, I think, equally present in male and female friendships, but it was more overtly connected to class in male friendships. And it typically played out in terms of kind of mocking oneself or each other in explicitly class terms, or taking the piss, as many put it colloquially. Peter, a banker in his 20s from a white working class family in Yorkshire, explained the enduring role here that taking the piss out of his friend Julian had played. Julian was white and had professional parents, had played since they met at university. But what was important here, I think, as you can see in the second quote, is that Julian would take it on the chin, implicitly accepting the critique of his class privilege. Friends from more privileged backgrounds also touched on humor and friendship. Ryan, who was in his 30s and worked in the charity sector, but whose parents had been very successful professionals, I think talked quite movingly about how class difference had continually threatened his friendship with Gary, who he first met at school and whose parents were both manual workers. He talked about taste differences in food and fashion. He talked about the role of money in insulating his career and not his friends. But for Ryan, humor was the thing that he and Gary reached for to diffuse what he called class tensions, a therapeutic way of managing it, he says here, to revert to having a laugh whenever class difference threatened to kind of bubble up and destabilize the friendship. Now, humor scholars, I did my PhD on humor, have long argued that one of the core functions of humor is to relieve tension, right? As a kind of mechanism for releasing pent-up emotions. You can see that in these accounts. But the use of humor in our data seemed more intricate than simply a valve for releasing tension. It was notable, for example, that class joking tended to skew one way, right? With mockery or self-deprecation punching upwards towards the more privileged friend more than downwards. And interviewees were often, I think, quite explicitly aware of this, that the use of humor was not just about negotiating class difference, but it was also often a way of kind of recognizing a politics of class. So in this way, our data speaks more to the work of the sociologist Michael Mulcahy, who talks about the distinction between a serious mode and a humorous mode of communication in human societies, whereby the humorous mode provides a kind of framework, a space for communication that allows people to embrace contradictions, play with misunderstandings, incongruity, and duality in their lives. So our argument then is that when people sort of enter into this humorous mode, it provides a kind of safe space for them to name and therefore register a mutual recognition of class difference that acts to kind of partially, at least, diffuse the tension brought about by those inequalities. The second way class diplomacy played out was via the active choice actually many had made to avoid discussing or registering their difference in the friendship. That might seem counterintuitive as a kind of successful mode of diplomacy, but actually the key facet of this avoidance was that it allowed forms of communication to flourish that interviewees were telling us basically would be stymied if they were to confront openly that class difference. Owen, who was from a lower middle class background, had met his very upper class friend Barnaby during a year abroad. Owen joked that he was socially mobile and angry, and talked about how he'd struggled at first with how clueless Barnaby was of his own privilege and the kind of classist jokes that he and his posh friends would make. But as you can see here, Owen had chosen careful avoidance of that difference in his relationship. I don't want to make it awkward, he says. And I think, you could detect a certain frustration here in that sort of avoidance. But also, Owen was clear that it had been a kind of necessary prerequisite for the development of what he said had become a kind of unbreakable bond with Barnaby, which he notes here had been forged by being completely honest with each other emotionally, crying in front of each other, becoming confidants, and essentially forging a closeness that neither of them had experienced in other male friendships. This foundation of emotional intimacy was often described actually as a kind of refuge for people in friendships. It was a kind of cherished place where both parties could reach for when moments of class danger emerged. So this is Madison. She was a white social worker in her 40s from a lower middle class background. She explained how she used avoidance to kind of pull back from moments of class tension with her friend Catherine when they discussed Catherine's wealth or the snobbishness of her husband. As she says here, we know where the line is and we'll move back from that line because of that affection and the love. The last form of diplomacy was more direct, was basically about openly confronting class difference in the friendship. And it's worth saying that those choosing this strategy were disproportionately women. And they often sort of acknowledged the risks of honesty, but maintained that it could be productive, right? Particularly if it was flanked by sensitivity, transparency, and empathy. So Shanti and Nadia, which I introduced earlier, were both very clear that it was only through continually confronting their class difference that their friendship had deepened. For example, here Shanti reflects on the importance of Nadia voicing her discomfort at her offers of financial subsidy, talking about it being a kind of learning curve. It was only through open communication, she notes here, that she realized that even if these offers were coming out of a place of love, they actually acted to introduce inequality and almost sort of acted to legitimize a power difference between them, which Nadia wanted to instead sort of insist or underline was ultimately an issue of politics or what she calls here chance. In other cases, confronting was about the power of acknowledging privilege. For Hannah, the key with her upper class friend Sophie was Sophie's constant use of qualifications to, as she says here, always add like 50 caveats when she spoke about life problems to make it clear she recognized the advantages that flanked her life. Now, there's obviously a dimension of humor in Sophie's self-deprecation here. This is a nice quote if you have time to read it. But joking is also a kind of vehicle for the demonstration of awareness of privilege. And that was clearly important to Hannah here. She might mock the caveat, 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 but as she notes, it allows them both to breeze past the difference and then get on to actually supporting each other with the differences they were actually facing. I'll pass you on to Rose now to move into the next part of the talk.
Great, thanks, Sam. Okay, so as Sam has outlined so far, we've argued that while class difference posed a fairly pervasive danger in these cross-class friendships, most of the people we interviewed enacted forms of class diplomacy to enable their friendship to persist. But beyond survival of friendship, we're really interested in whether there's a wider sociological significance to these forms of class diplomacy. So in this second part of the talk, we argue that acts of class diplomacy pave the way for forms of symbolic exchange to take place between these friends. Now, by symbolic exchange, we're talking here about the deeds that friends did for one another, they enacted, they gifted one another, including care and emotional support, but that were reciprocal. So we argue this reciprocity was paramount for these cross-class friendships to survive and for friends in turn to avoid becoming estranged by the inequality, to quote from Sennett. So ongoing reciprocity of symbolic exchange between friends from different class origin backgrounds enabled them to build mutuality and sustain their friendship over time. But they also, in turn, often had a mutual socializing effect and could lead to a heightened political sensitivity to class inequality. So for the rest of this talk, I'll map out our argument about this further section and then end with some implications we see arising from the findings. Do you mind flipping that? Thanks, Sam. Okay. So across our interviews, we were struck by how often when enacting class diplomacy, people explained it had allowed forms of reciprocity to develop. So here we've got John, who's white, who's a consultant in his 30s from a working class background, and he'd been friends with Oscar since they were housemates at university. Oscar is also white. He hails from a middle-class background and was privately educated. And while class difference had initially been a barrier in their friendship, they'd both used humor and open discussion to negotiate these tensions. And for John, the payoff of class diplomacy was profound in his words. He described it having generated an intimacy, as he explains here, that he'd never experienced before in male friendship. Also notable here is that John saw class difference as an enabler rather than a barrier to emotional intimacy, and both he and Oscar were seemingly released from expectations of masculinity they might experience in their own class milieu. And just as central here is the notion of exchange, of this transversal dynamic allowing each to let their emotional guard down and cry. So class diplomacy had enabled symbolic exchanges that were also more asymmetric, that combined both material and emotional resources. So what do we mean by this? Sam has introduced our concept of transversality and reciprocity that we're using, drawing on the work of Amanda Wise, and that this attention to transversality is not only about exchange, but interchange, this sense of opening up and reconfiguring identities. So we deploy this work to argue that identities may be shifted in moments of non-hierarchical reciprocity within sustained cross-class friendships, and that word sustained is really important, and sometimes mutually reconfigured in the process. We further draw from Richard Sennett on the capacity for asymmetric exchange of non-market actions and deeds between people to forge connections and social bonds through feelings of reciprocity. So as Sennett argues, mutuality in friendship is not about equivalence, rather it takes place when we take part in exchange that is not objectively commensurate. So we become connected by performing asymmetrical exchanges together rather than being estranged by this inequality. So we found that these kinds of exchanges were vital for these cross-class friendships to persist. Friends took part in these forms of reciprocity that were symbolic, that mediated unequal statuses in their friendship. And these forms of exchange, the things they did for one another, the things they gifted, the care they showed, the support they gave, acquired emotional consequence precisely because they couldn't be translated into equivalent material values. Just to be clear, we're not suggesting that exchanges take place either just external to or within market logics, and we're critically aware of the fact that reciprocity can lead to other social obligations, it can lead to complex feelings of gratitude, to indebtedness, even emotional bondage. So we're very aware of this literature and these repercussions and that this can generate and hinder relationships. But of relevance here is the widely agreed upon premise that reciprocity of some sort is foundational to mutual respect within social relations, and it's something entirely omitted from the Chetty and Co. scholarship. So in this example, Gemma, who's a teacher, she's white, she's in her 40s, and she'd met her upper middle class friend Amelia when their kids attended the same primary school. Gemma's from a working class origin. She explained that she'd relied heavily on Amelia throughout their friendship, particularly financially. And while she was sometimes self-conscious that she couldn't reciprocate economically in the friendship, she spoke passionately in her interview about how they had maintained reciprocity in their friendship. As her friend told her, it's not just a one-sided thing. Of course, we are critical and careful here that exchange can still operate as a form of obligation that reflects and embeds power relations. And some may even read the reciprocity outlined here by Jenna as underpinned by inequality or even condescension. But we're equally conscious of not reading behind the backs of our participants. And Gemma did not read the friendship this way. Like many interviewees from less advantaged backgrounds, she was emphatic about the value of reciprocity for them both. So we argue following Sennett that these forms of symbolic exchanges between friends, such as the provision of care for children or providing emotional support in times of stress, were important precisely because they couldn't be translated into equivalent material values. So such reciprocity not only achieved forms of interpersonal equality, but it also had a deep socializing effect on both parties. And this was even the case among those who used avoidance as a mode of class diplomacy. So Ryan, whom we introduced earlier, had used humor but also avoidance in his friendship with Gary. But here class avoidance did not imply a lack of recognition. On the contrary, they were both hyper-aware of class difference, as Ryan notes here. So instead, for Ryan, avoidance was about preventing class tension. However pressing and vital this was, from destabilizing the friendship. That allowed him and Gary to concentrate on developing forms of reciprocity over many years around their shared love of things like art, design, music, that had had a big impact on them both. And as he said, that's been mutual learning. Again, what was striking to us in these accounts of symbolic exchange was not that identities were somehow left behind in the process. So to be clear, these are not accounts of class assimilation, but nor are they accounts of class exoticization. They're explanations of how aspects of themselves, the dispositions of the habitus, had been partially reconfigured by habitual practices of non-hierarchical reciprocity. And this reconfiguration is important, we're arguing, because it often seemed to yield a certain criticality or sensitivity to the issue of class. And I should say this last part of our argument is tentative, and that we want to be clear that we are not recounting stories of abrupt rupture in people's personal class politics. That's not what we're saying. Instead, we're arguing that we heard that successful class diplomacy had enabled people to enact ongoing forms of reciprocity with a class subjectivity very different to their own, and that in turn many felt had produced a heightened sensitivity to class boundaries. So for those from more advantaged backgrounds like Theo here, this was often about understanding and confronting one's own class privilege. For those reflecting on their friendship from a less advantaged position, there was often a sense that ongoing discussions about class with their more privileged friend had led to mutual changes in beliefs and behavior, as John mentions here. And what's interesting in this account is that while the behavioral change highlighted is led by the more privileged friend in this friendship, John acknowledges there has been a sense of reciprocity. This ongoing symbolic exchange had enabled, in his own words, him to develop greater empathy on a personal level while maintaining his class criticality. So, to conclude, in this research, we're arguing, we're providing a sociological response to the recent high-profile work in economics, which asserts that cross-class friendships are a key driver of social mobility. So, yes, our findings show that, in a limited sense, these studies are accurate. Friendships formed across class origin difference can produce social capital for less advantaged friends. However, what's obscured in this quantitative work is how this actually takes place in practice and the effects it has on the friendship. So we've shown that these one-way transfers of social capital often generate feelings of inequality or indebtedness that build tensions and sometimes precipitate friendship breakdown. Now, in contrast, successful cross-class friendships in our data were characterized by a very different dynamic. It was reciprocity and mutuality. But to achieve this, friends needed to persistently negotiate their class differences via a process we have called class diplomacy. And our findings suggest that when successful, class diplomacy can pave the way for forms of symbolic exchange that strengthen social bonds, have a mutually socializing effect, and can even lead to a heightened political sensitivity to class inequality. And we think, lastly, this has implications for a range of fields that I'll end on this final slide. Thanks, Sam. So for sociologists, class diplomacy might provide a useful conceptual apparatus to understand other kinds of cross-class relationships. The lens of transversality may be helpful for dislodging distinction as the prevailing paradigm in understanding how these relationships may work. It may enable us to recognize moments not shaped by status struggles or exchanges of capital, but where people seek connection when separated by visceral inequality, even when such moments may be fraught, contradictory, and emotionally taxing, as we've documented. For scholars of Bourdieu, cross-class friendship may be a useful site for thinking through long-standing questions about the durability of the habitus. The first point here is quite obvious. While Bourdieu assumed that the habitus will guide people away from forging cross-class friendships, the work that we've outlined, that we're responding to, suggests that such relationships, at least in their weak tie form, are much more widespread. But beyond this, we argue that cross-class friendships may have the capacity to produce important disruptions in the habitus. So we turn here to Bourdieu's argument that people tend to self-eliminate from cross-class friendships for the same reason they do for social mobility, because these processes have the capacity to threaten the dispositional architecture of the habitus. In the case of the long-range upwardly mobile, where one's movement through social space dislocates the relationship between habitus and field, Bourdieu argued that people develop a cleft habitus, torn by contradiction and internal division. And while he saw this as being driven by hidden psychic injuries, he insisted that being between two class worlds endowed one with a unique capacity for reflexivity and self-analysis, that they can see the boundaries of class more clearly. So we're arguing here that close cross-class friendships may provide a similar lens when they contain the kinds of symbolic exchanges that we've documented here, contingent on class diplomacy. Um, they argue sustained cross-class friendship have the ability to provide a critical sensitivity to class boundaries alongside a deep empathy for class subjectivities fundamentally different to one's own. And finally, our results provide a partial rejoinder to those who, in a rush to assert normative commitments to social mobility, may have passed over the lived complexities of cross-class friendship in real life. And we contend that policymakers devote attention not simply to the creation of cross-class friendships, but to their quality and longevity and to fostering the conditions under which they might actually thrive. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rose and Sam. That was great. Cheers. Um, so I've asked for the attendees to ask some questions. No one's come forward yet. I think that might have something to do with the new, harder to do format, which in this kind of more secure version of Zoom we're using here. So I might start off and see if we can engender some while we're talking. Um, so yeah, I've got like lots of questions, but I'm intrigued just in the recruitment, just a recruitment question, for instance, the self-choice of. So had these people kind of, before seeing your recruitment material, thought about their friendships through the class lens, or did that moment kind of engender a kind of reverse looking back at it? Because are people kind of reflexive about this, have been reflexive about it throughout their friendships and thought about it a lot before you kind of are asking the sociological questions about it?
I can have a go at that, Rose. Yeah, that's a really nice question actually, Steve, because I mean, I don't think we have a definitive answer to that. Because we didn't sort of ask that to them specifically. All we know is that, they obviously did recognize that the friendship was cross-class, otherwise they wouldn't have volunteered. I think though,
Mm,
reading across the transcripts, I don't know if you agree, Rose, I think the thing that's important to remember is that, class, there's a language around class and class identity in Britain that's quite strong still, I think. And so my sense is that in a lot of these cases, people had recognized that, the notion that they were from different class backgrounds was just so powerfully present, um, that, it was saturated in their narration of their friendships,
mm,
from start to finish, in ways that to me feel fairly familiar from doing hundreds of interviews with UK participants about elements of class. Um, I think maybe in a few cases, and this is why I made that caveat about people in cross-class friendships that don't necessarily recognize them as such. Maybe for some of the avoiders, um, that that aspect may have been a bit less present, and that was then part of the avoidance. You have a sort of lingering sense that there's something different,
mm,
um but you don't necessarily have this kind of sort of full-blown language to discuss it with, and even if you did, for the reasons we've suggested, you don't necessarily raise those.
mm. Yeah.
But I mean, on that, I don't know what you think, Rose, but it would be a very interesting question when we do the work in Australia to see whether that's a different, where you see a difference there, where
Mm.
there's perhaps less of a kind of discourse around class that people can
Mm,
reach for easily in Australia.
Well, with the previous one on intimacy, it was very much a cathartic sense of having a complex feeling recognized and being externalized by someone and being drawn to that. So I'm imagining, I mean, I've done about 15 interviews so far. I have found that as well, but I'm expecting more of that.
yeah. I instantly, for some reason, I thought when I was hearing about the the description of the research at the start of the Paired Peers project in the UK. Be
Mm.
fascinating to talk to both friends. Have you got any? Have, have you got any pairs?
Yes, we do. Yeah. So we've got, I think is there 5 pairs? There's about 10 respondents, I think, who,
You see.
uh, yeah.
Yeah.
So decent. And those are really rich,
Yeah.
for all sorts of reasons. And yeah, I
Do you
think
have any that's like one's using comedy and one's an avoider?
that's a good question, actually. I don't think so. I think there's a sense in which, and maybe again, there's a selection effect here, right?
Yeah.
So to both opt in, you've
Mm.
probably had to have talked about it
Yeah.
and to know that each other were doing it. Um, uh, a lot of people, in a couple of cases, you had people who talked about the friendship and then at the end said, "Oh, would you like to talk to my friend?" And
Yeah.
then they reached out to the friend.
Ah, cool.
Um, and then I suppose there's a kind of interesting question. And in other cases, and I think this is worth saying, people would say, I really wouldn't feel comfortable telling my friend that I was having this interview.
Mm.
Um,
Interesting.
because, particularly for some of those avoiders,
Yeah.
that's part and parcel of it, that you don't, by saying I'm having the interview, you're disrupting the avoidance, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So I've got some questions in the Q&A and Sam and Rose, you can probably click on the Q&A to see these questions if you want to kind of prepare in advance, but I'll read them out for the video. So from my colleague at Newcastle, Cara Brosnan, Peg's fascinating study. I'm curious about about how the friendships were formed in the first place. Was it mostly through education? Were there examples of friendships formed later in life? And if so, how did they differ?
Trying to remember, I was higher. This university was obviously a big one. Um,
Yeah, I think university was probably the most prevalent. School was also mentioned a lot. And also quite a lot of people had met in sort of casual work, so sort of retail, hospitality. And it's
Mm,
kind of interesting in a way. I mean, this is not a study of the conditions on that that help foster cross-class relationships, but I think all three of those are spaces which are fairly rare in the UK, where you do get people from
yeah.
different backgrounds coming together in various ways.
yeah, I did note that there's a limited, in terms of Prue's research in Australia, the actual opportunity to engage in a sustained period over time is very limited.
Yeah.
Mm.
Something through this data.
I'd imagine sport might be another one that where it may happen. Maybe
Yeah,
less so
We
in the
had
UK than Australia. I'm not
yeah,
sure.
I
Yeah.
don't think we had any sport.
no,
I
we
might,
didn't. Although I think, I mean, there was the thing that's interesting about sport in the UK is it's actually deeply classed. I don't
yeah,
know.
much more than Australia.
Yeah, and I think I was maybe expecting more through, civic type of organizations, maybe religion as well. These are other spaces where
Mm.
you might get it. I think the point in a way though is that, that largely these were the successful ones had transcended those initial institutional starting points.
Yeah.
And in a way, that was often the narration of the most interesting part of the friendships, is sort of how you survive beyond a setting in which perhaps the class difference has been um, flattened by the institutional setting, right? So,
Yeah.
you go to school, you all wear the same school uniform. You go to university, there are some elements of shared experience that flatten some of the differences. You're at work, you're both earning the same salary at the same time. But as soon as you move out of those institutions, the class trajectories become more fraught and more, they were always there, but I think people are narrating like it was often harder to keep going beyond those moments.
Yeah. I know that in the hospitality work that we did a few years ago, that yeah, definitely a space where people from different classes come in for a while and mix,
Yeah.
but those from disadvantaged backgrounds were much more likely to become hospital lifers. Others were often just kind of
Mm.
moving through it to another career, right? So it'd be interesting to see how friendships would pertain after that. I've got another question here from another colleague at University of Newcastle, Vanessa Bowden. I love this research. I think the concept of class diplomacy is super interesting. I'm wondering about the longevity here. Similar to previous questions, I suppose, if there's some capacity for identifying when these friendships don't work out.
Mm.
Well, I mean, very much in our data, it's clear that the lack of reciprocity was this underlying point of destruction in the friendships. Um, the ones that we ended up that we focused on, the longevity is central to it, and we have wanted to look at temporality in this as well. But I think in terms of this, oh, sorry.
Just me.
Oh, right. I think in terms of, yeah, what was I going to say? I got sidebarred by you jump in, Sam. I got sidebarred by the question here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think, there are, I think Rose is right. The real common factor is this sense that, people felt that the class difference, as we narrated, it's often about a lack of reciprocity whereby, um, either, you sort of feel like you can't reciprocate, or you feel like there's something about the class difference whereby that there's some sort of basic difference in your sort of experience of the world that's just never going to lead to a certain type of sort of the types of more symbolic exchange reciprocity that we were talking about to actually be able to develop. And I mean, they were really sad actually, these accounts. Like they were quite painful in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
There's probably, I think we did 41, and I think something like six completely ended and about five had sort of drifted apart. And, you could do you could do a specific paper, I think, just looking at
Yeah.
those. They were often very emotional. And as Rose said, I think probably similar to other types of relationships, there was generally a kind of cathartic air to these interviews where
Yeah.
people wanted to talk about them. Yeah. Don't know
Yeah.
if Rose, if you
No, I
remember.
agree. And also the sense of moving past. Something we've talked a lot about is class exoticization.
Yeah.
And people
Yes.
with falling into that assumption that there's exoticizing going on in these friendships. And the ones that broke down, that was apparent.
Yeah.
People never got beyond that spectacle of difference and intrigue from different sides. And so that was something that we really want to stress in the paper we're writing on this at the moment, a way of that this is not about exoticization. There's something else going on when you move beyond that, because you can't continue to exotify
Yeah.
people when you live this intimately with them in these friendships.
Yeah.
Especially we're talking over 10, 20 years
Yeah. That's
in some
fascinating.
cases.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but in some cases.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and just to piggyback on that, I think the same when you saw it with one of the interviewees. It's the same with the assimilation point, that in instances where you felt like, okay, I the only way I can keep being with this friend is to sort of accept that their culture is the way we will be together. And if that is something which, brings a lot of sort of ontological distress, people were pulling back often because they didn't want that.
Hmm.
They didn't want that. It's a bit like some of the literature talks about a sort of self-elimination that goes on in occupational spaces,
Yeah.
where people decide they don't want what they would have to change to be in order to get the rewards that that sort of suggests. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of that Borgesian refuse what one's already refused kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. Okay. Um, the I was intrigued by the kind of two guys, crying in front of each other. How much is that about masculinity and not class?
I
I'll let you
think
answer that, Sam.
yeah, it's really interesting that the men crying comes up in at least three, I think, of the interviews, and in slightly different ways in different ones. But I think the people talked about it interestingly as a kind of a marker of the strength of intimacy.
Hmm.
So it was sort of seen as like, to demonstrate to us, the interviewer, of how close we are. This is something that regularly do together. And that was often premised on this idea that that in itself is very unusual for male friendships. But in some cases, I think, as one of the friendships kind of illustrated, there was a sense of almost masculinity being classed in sort of intergenerationally stable ways, i.e., it's sort of unacceptable for men to cry in front of other male friends, both for working class men and for middle class men to some extent. But weirdly, the cross class friendship released them from that expectation to some extent.
Hmm.
Um, and so they felt like, you know, they, some of the gendered performance that they were sort of routinely used to, the cross class friendship released them from that. And so that allowed for this kind of for this intimacy to take place.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, looks like we might have another question. Another Newcastle colleague, Randy Owen. At this point of difference, there's the point about reciprocity that you've been speaking about, but were there reflections about how these relationships shaped the capacity for recognition more broadly? Maybe this goes to Rose's point about rejecting exoticization, but really what I'm wondering about is how it shapes broader relations, perceptions, and recognitions beyond the immediate friendship to work how they related to those who might not raise to the status of friends but acquaintances.
Mhm.
Did people talk about these shifts? Yeah, does the kind of exposure to someone from a different class make you more open to or or whatever to other people? Yeah.
Oh, the big question.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I think this is the question, I think, for us.
So this is kind of what you're reckoning with overall at the moment
I
about
think
a
I think we are really fascinated by this, but we're also very careful about
hmm.
making huge statements here and about the limits of our data. I don't know, Rose, if you want to. I mean, I've got lots of
Yeah.
slides, but yeah.
No, yeah, we've this was one of the early sort of questions that drove the project, and we go around in circles and back and forth. And I'm very influenced by the everyday multicultural literature, the everyday multiculturalism literature. I think there's a lot to be gleaned from that about kind of grand statements like this, because there's always the arguments that um, in any sort of difference, overexposure can have the opposite effect, right? We know about porous boundaries where there's lack of resources that people can then put up harder class boundaries in a sense, like harder moral and other sorts of boundaries.
Hmm.
But I think we've come to the conclusion, tentatively, that these people described a sense of class criticality, like they did, that is, and they was something that wasn't, we didn't ask them straight out X, Y, Z. It was something that comes through in the data, and we do want to acknowledge that without making sort of grand claims, but we do think it's important and we do think it's there in the data. Sam.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think the question marks are we can only see what we can see, which is an expressed class criticality in the interview exchange to us. Those felt real and they felt meaningful to the participants. But of course, we have no way of knowing whether those dovetail with behavior, as well as the extent to which they are a product of the relationship itself. And so, you're around this person who has really sort of worked on you and really you've sort of mutually you've shaped each other as one friendship pair put it. Um, you might have cross critical thoughts when you're with them, but as soon as you're not with them and your life is otherwise quite class congruent, does that criticality stand? Does it continue to influence, as the question suggests, mere acquaintances, other types of interactions? I think that is much more sort of an open question for us.
Hmm.
We're not naive, I think, about the sort of transformative potential here. But equally, I think we can really see it in the data, and I think it's kind of fascinating the ways in which it was narrated. And I think in and of itself, with its limitations, that is sociologically worthwhile to explore or
Oh,
think about.
absolutely. I mean, speaking there to kind of the qualitative researchers' constant kind of need to apparently like positivize all of our research to compare and contrast to everything, right? I think if it's in your data, you don't necessarily have to extrapolate it out to make kind of conclusions about the wider world. But like if it's in there,
Yeah.
it's in there. It's a thing.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting that. So like, well, we're getting towards the end of the hour. Just I suppose like I'd like to quickly finish by asking you like, yeah, what's next?
Well,
Uh,
this is a paper that we're about to submit that we've been working on for about, I don't know, a while now, just on the UK data. We have a second paper that we're working on about that centers gender, because we've had very interesting different
Yeah,
gender perspectives on their analysis of the data. That's been really interesting, and generated great critical insight. So that's our next one. And then we're doing the Australian data, and then we'd like to look at comparisons between them. But we'll see what's generated from the Australian data.
yeah. Oh, that's
Any-
great. Well, maybe we can get you both back next year to hear about that. Not to put a deadline on getting it all done, but yeah,
We'd love that. We'd love
yeah,
that.
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Thanks for hosting us,
yeah.
Steve.
So excellent. So thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it, and
Yeah.
thanks to everyone that came today. And we'll put this up on YouTube to see if other people here want to share it around, so other people can see the research as well. So thank you. I'll end it
Really
there.
great questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.